You have gods which are tied to specific peoples, specific cultures, histories, and places with their own literature about them and so on. Therefore, an exclusive local religion, but at the same time, you have a shared worldview and you can have this grander element.
It's this prophecy of complete conquest and complete domination. And this is something that I think the Romans, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, many Romans felt that it was their prophecy to literally conquer the world. And I think that's the ultimate ideal. I think it's something that Evola talks about with the concept of imperium as the ultimate state of man, which isn't just petty nationalism or petty local governance, but absolute expansion, even to the point where you might fail, which I think is the ideal that I generally believe is most worthy, this sort of manifest destiny. Salvete legionaries, I have come back from a journey of many miles, all the way to visit the Ark in the far-off planet of Mars, not the Mars that is in between the Earth and the rest of the solar system. I'm talking about the Mars beyond the physical world, in the meta world, and I have brought the Ark back with me. We are currently dining at a villa off the shores of Epirus in Greece, and I'm enjoying a nice bottle of white wine, and the Ark is enjoying this same bottle, and we're having olives and grapes, and nymphs are bringing us platters of roast lamb and other fine dishes. But anyway, welcome, Ark. What great weather we have today, am I right?
Certainly. I trace my ancestry back to Mars for any viewers who don't know. I hope that doesn't give away my identity. But I am, directly descended from Mars through Romulus, of course.
Of course. And on that topic, we might have to retransport the viewer's mind to a different age, an earlier age. We're going to transplant you to the original legion, which wasn't even a legion in the physical sense yet. It was just a band of vagabonds, bandits, thieves, petty criminals who were rallied under a man by the name of Romulus, the great so forth grandfather of the Ark. And he got all these Latins together, these absolute disgusting but also strong and virile men. They were smelly because they were living off the land and barely scraping by. And this Romulus came around and he said, all right, we're going to form the city of Rome. And of course, well, why is Romulus so significant? Well, he is a descendant of Aeneas. And of course, Aeneas is the son of Venus. And you say, well, the son of Venus, paganism, right? Well, that's going to be the topic of conversation for today, is pagan Europe and the historical implications of pagan Europe, and perhaps the future of European religion, whether that's going to be Christianity, paganism, or some form of secularism. But I'm going to transport you back to the Roman times. You are a legionary on the verge of a great campaign, and you must give offerings to Jupiter. You must slice the large bull and have a seer read its entrails, and the fortunes of the entrails are fortuitous. You shall have a great campaign. Julius Evola talks a lot about the experience of the early pagan Roman and just how entrenched faith was in their view of the world. And in fact, to Evola, one such method of worship, of course, was the Roman campaign, was proving the mettle of the Roman man through warfare. And this proved that they were destined by the gods for greatness. And of course, the early pagan European is this very aesthetic figure whose worship of the pagan gods is not an ascetic worship. It's not going to some monastery and reading old books and burning incense. Of course, that's part of it. But the more important worship is the physical worship. The cult of Bacchus, for instance, which maybe took it a little too far. But like the original term for hedonism was just this sort of frenzied Dionysian revelry, this very frantic sort of partying energy. And that's how you worship Dionysus. It was through song and wine and pleasure. So it's very interesting. And maybe the Ark can talk to us a little bit, give a brief introduction about more of the meta behind pagan Europe, since I'm more attuned to the Greek and Roman methods of worship. And I know the Ark here, he loves his Hyperborean women, so perhaps he knows a little bit more about the Nordic pagans and the rest of Europe.
Of course, of course. Well, maybe I'll start by going on a little bit of a tangent. I was watching Fortress of Lug, the YouTube channel. You might know him, or some of your viewers might know him. I was watching one of his videos on the founding myth of Rome, Romulus and Remus. And he was saying that it is possible that both Remus and Ymir in the Norse tradition stem from the same root word and possibly from the same mythological motif. I think the word would be, well, I'll look it up in a minute, but the Indo-European reconstructed word for twin. And of course, the world is made out of the different parts of Ymir, torn apart. And part of the Romulus and Remus myth in some versions is that Remus's different parts of Remus's body parts are buried around the city of Rome. So we could perhaps see a mini kind of creation of the cosmos in the Romulus and Remus myth, the Indo-European trope of the two twins. And so that's interesting to think about, how you might have a cosmic creation myth then imposed on the local. But also what this made me think about was how, the pagan tradition is very scattered. Like the sources we have conflict. There's many different versions of myths. There's, just a bunch of organic traditions that we have to pull from, but nothing that was solidified. Much like early Christianity, where there were all sorts of different sects believing all sorts of different things, and it was just kind of chaotic. And if you imagine that Christianity then didn't become formalized, let's say it didn't really take off the way it did, maybe it, different sects survived, but with very differing, beliefs. You have the Gnostics, and some Christians believe in the resurrection, maybe some don't. And then if you were to then try to resurrect Christianity, probably what you'd have to do is go through that formalization process. And I think that's kind of the position paganism is today. If it's going to be revived in modernity, there are already plenty of different pagan organizations and people practicing paganism, so the kind of organic element is there and the traditions are there. But if it's really going to become a powerful force which could compete with Christianity and Islam, it would have to undergo some sort of formalization, I believe.
It's interesting that you should mention that, and I think that's a good segue into the origins of the pagan mythos, and something that Bap talks about in Bronze Age Mindset, and then of course Costin Alamario talks about in Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, is essentially, well, because both like any sort of pagan tradition is pantheistic, but of course that doesn't mean that they're all created the same. The pantheon of the Indo-European gods, of course, is one of essentially steppe peoples, and steppe peoples who live nomadic, horse lord lifestyles, versus the pantheon of gods, for example, say the Egyptians or the early Mesopotamians. They make their way of life off of working the land. So of course their mythos is grounded in the earth. It's grounded in rites of fertility. And that's not to say that you don't get that later on with the sort of synchronization of the Indo-European paganism once it conquers proto-Europe, or not proto-Europe, sorry, like pre-Europe, essentially, like before, let's call it longhouse societies, for example. Of course, there's a lot of synchronization, and you end up with a combination of the Indo-European gods and the early fertility gods. But I just want to make a distinction first off. And I like to bring up the book Evolution of Civilizations often when we're talking about the sort of origins of these things and the origins of the Indo-European pagan religion. Like I said, it's built from a people who made their living off of a nomadic lifestyle. And I think it's in selective breeding that they talk about the early shepherd versus the early farmer, and how the farmer has, because he has a grounded view of life in the sense that his livelihood comes from staring at the earth, growing things from the earth. It's literally, from a psychological view, grounded in the earth. It's grounded to being tied to a specific location, where the nomad or the shepherd, I think it was in selective breeding, Costin paints a picture. Let's say you're a shepherd on an open plain at night watching your flock, and all you have to keep you company is the stars and is the vast land. And of course, for the nomad, you have to constantly be moving to survive. You have to constantly be seeking better grounds, better fields to feed your flocks, to feed your horses, to feed your sheep, your goats, whatever. And also, you have to be constantly moving, because a lot of times you're subsisting your lifestyle off of hunting as well. So you have to follow the good hunting grounds, which means that you're constantly moving. You're constantly striving to find something better, to find something more. And this, of course, is the Faustian spirit, in the sense of seeking the limitless, seeking the endless sort of expansion. And this is what the nomad experiences in a psychological level. His livelihood comes from constant movement, constant seeking of more, compared to the farmer, whose livelihood is grounded to a specific locale. And this is reflected in the way that their pantheons are demonstrated in mythos. So, of course, for the Indo-European, the nomad, their central god, and of course he goes by many names, whether that's sort of a mixture of Thor and Odin, whether that's Zeus, whether that's Tengri in the more Turkic variations, it's always this sky god. And the reason why the sky is their god is because of what I'm demonstrating with this sort of detached relationship with the physical. It's always wanting to strive more. It's wanting to go beyond. It's wanting to expand. And so therefore, when your livelihood is built upon movement and is built upon expansion and is built upon going beyond, your highest ideal is going to be the sky. It's going to be something which is endless, like the sky. And on the other hand, these early farming societies ground themselves into the earth. Therefore, because the earth, the soil, is what grants them livelihood, they attach a mythos of a god, a fertility god, which is generally a woman, which is so generally their societies develop matriarchally. They tie their ultimate ideal to the earth. They tie it to being stuck in one place. And so when people try to consider, well, what made the early Indo-Europeans so great? It was because the very fabric and psychological ramification of their beliefs was one of constant expansion, of constant conquest. And when you are always called to expand, you are called into competition with other people who are trying to expand. And over time, of course, the weaker are whittled down and only the strongest quality survives. And this, I think, leads to the exceptionalism of the early Indo-European, and the reason why they inevitably conquered the longhouse societies of Europe, why they conquered the farming societies in Mesopotamia. In fact, Egypt was like the only society which is rooted from this fertility pantheon to survive. Every other one lost, including the societies in India, of course, during the Vedic period. The Indo-European invaders also conquered them. Egypt was the only one, and they fought off the Sea Peoples. But eventually they decayed as well. And of course, they were conquered by the Persians, which were a steppe people, a sky people. And, I've gone on a little bit, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say, Ark. And I'm sure you probably have some thoughts on this as well.
Yes, it's an interesting question. And I think it's also becoming a more complicated one recently, because we're all familiar with this narrative of the steppe chads coming and beating up the puny farmers and stealing their wives and such, which I've talked about on my channel as well. And there's definitely evidence that the farming populations of Europe were, in worse health. They had smaller stature, I think, worse teeth and that sort of thing. Whereas you look at the skeletons of the steppe peoples and they have like these massive skulls and all of that. But at the same time, evidence seems to be showing that the farming populations of Europe were actually very warlike, and they had very complex societies. And apparently the influx, a new paper was released that said the influx of steppe people into Europe actually lowered the IQ. So maybe we should be thinking about it like these grugs come in from the steppe, low IQ grugs, and they club all these smart, sensitive young men farmers. But
Cringe.
so in that regard, maybe my Italian ancestors are getting some redemption. It's really the agriculturalists who are the master people. But I think it's a very complicated picture, and when we even try to reconstruct Indo-European religion, that's very complicated as well, because for example, in Roman myth, the myth of Romulus and Remus, I think, is one of the few things which we can really trace back to, concretely to having Indo-European origins. If you look at the Norse pantheon, Odin does not seem to have Indo-European origins. It's possible, but Odin is not an equivalent of the sky father of Jupiter. In early Roman religion, before it was Hellenized, it seems like Mars played a more central role, and may not actually be the same deity as Ares originally, I think. So we don't know that much about early Roman religion, but perhaps Mars took a more central position as Odin does in the Norse pantheon. So it's very hard to reconstruct a religion, but I think what you can reconstruct quite easily is the worldview. And so while you have different characters and gods in the Norse sagas, there's some overlap, and different characters and gods in Homer, you can see that they share the same worldview. And you can see this very clearly. The ideas about fate, about kinship, about honor, excellence, the gods and their relation to mankind, certain rituals, all of this is very distinct and shared across Europe. So I think when constructing or reconstructing a European paganism, what should probably be focused on is the worldview more than the gods. And I think in modernity, that's especially relevant because, again, you could use the example of Christianity. In early Christianity, maybe you get together with your bros, you go into the catacombs, you're, doing an early version of the Eucharist. It's very organic, it's community based. And then maybe the Christians, in the city next to you don't believe the same thing. They might even believe something that's, kind of completely different, but that doesn't really matter, right? But it begins to matter when you're trying to construct a unified religion. And especially in modernity, we're very unrooted. Most people are probably not going to have a pagan temple near them. They might not even have, a church that they like near them. Even if there is a church, it could be a different sect. So I think worldview becomes even more important in modernity, because that's what really ties us together. Like, we've never met each other. We've only been brought together through the internet, and we've come together in the sphere of ideas, in the sphere of worldview. So I think in modernity, a worldview is even more important than the organic part of the religion, although that is also, extremely important. It has to be organic.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. And just going back to what you said about the whole, I haven't read the paper you mentioned, but I will say that, I mean, I'm very partial to, like I said, or I haven't said it before in this podcast, but I've talked before, for example, of Rome. And of course, Rome is not this nomadic society. If anything, the expansion of Rome as an imperial power often came in opposition to these more sort of loose tribal confederations, which lived more similarly to these sort of early steppe peoples, even though they weren't necessarily horse lords. So I'm very partial to a more sedentary lifestyle, but psychologically, I think you don't want a sedentary mindset. That's something I want to distinguish, is sort of this psychological phenomena of what I'm talking about versus the biological. So of course, biologically, and maybe this paper that you mentioned has credence, but um, let's just take it on a more simple scale. Of course, biologically, you might say, okay, well, some people argue that the steppe people were stronger. Some people argue that they're smarter. Maybe they weren't. Um, that's one thing, right? So there's the biological of, well, maybe these early peoples were strong because they're nomadic, and a nomadic lifestyle breeds a stronger type of human. But of course, in Europe, none of these nomadic peoples who migrated retained a nomadic lifestyle to the degree that they did on the steppes, right? So even though you have, these sometimes nomadic German tribes, for example, they weren't a horse people anymore. They weren't living like their ancestors. A lot of times they were experimenting with farming, uh, or they had a very reduced nomadic lifestyle where the distances they would go was far lesser, right? So of course, all of Europe, none of Europe in, let's say, um, from like 1000 BC to the fall of Rome, none of them were really nomadic anymore. And of course, you have nomadic migrations even during Rome. Of course, you have the Visigoths, you have the Vandals, you have the Huns, but all of them eventually adopt a more sedentary lifestyle. But I think what I would advocate for is the psychology of the steppe tribesman, the psychology of the nomadic man. Because, of course, Rome is very sedentary. They subsist significantly off of farming. Their diet consists greatly of carbohydrates. They were eating a lot of grains. Um, they were producing most of their food from the earth. So, biologically, right? And some people take issue with Rome because of this. They were very much a sedentary peoples in a sort of physical way, and the Greeks as well, right? And of course, I mean, probably the reason for this is once the original sort of nomadic tribesmen take over, they establish themselves at the top of the hierarchy. They have the native peoples do the farming. So whether that's Rome and the sort of divide between the patrician and plebeian class, or if it's something like Sparta, for instance, where you have the Helots as a slave population, ultimately, none of these people are nomads anymore on a physical level. But what I think they do retain is they retain this sort of, let's call it the Faustian spirit in a sense. They retain that psychology of the nomad. They retain that psychology of wanting to expand, of wanting to come into conflict with others. And I think that's what's important. So I think it's similar to what you're talking about, Ark, where you're saying, well, maybe whatever it actually was in the past isn't so as important as the essence, which is the worldview. And that's, I think, something I agree with. And I think capturing the psychology of exceptionalism is more important than necessarily having every ritual be exactly the same, or having every prayer the same down to a T. It's like, oh no, you got one word of Our Father wrong. You're being excommunicated from the church, which, and it's like you say, it's interesting that you mentioned Odin, and I'm gonna have to do some research about that, about Odin not having Indo-European roots. And of course, Thor is much more resembling of a sort of Zeus or Tengri type figure, because of course, Thor being in the sky. But you know who Odin reminds me of in a lot of ways is Prometheus, because they both had to sacrifice to sort of introduce I mean, Odin had to literally sacrifice his life to go to the underworld and learn all these secrets. He had to take out his eye to drink from the pool of knowledge, and all this. And it's sort of this egregore. So the word egregore is this. It's not like a real god, for instance, but an egregore is like the idea of a god, and the idea of a god that becomes implanted into the psychology of the people who follow that god. So the Promethean egregore, for instance, is one of seeking knowledge. It's one of well, it's actually good to bite from the apple of knowledge. So a lot of people compare Prometheus to Lucifer, for instance, but with very different connotations, where Lucifer is seen as an evil figure in the Abrahamic faith. Prometheus is seen as an enlightening figure in the Hellenic faith. And I think, although the Odin story isn't so much about giving knowledge to man, he also has to go through sacrifice to obtain knowledge himself, the same way that Prometheus, for giving fire to man, has to go through hundreds of years of absolute torture until he's freed by Hercules. Which, and I'll sort of close off what I'm talking about. Obviously, you have your new video coming out, Ark, and I've seen it, and you talk about the universalism of Christianity, for instance, compared to this sort of exceptional worldview which the pagan man shares. And I think it comes down to this sort of psychological phenomena that I'm talking about. As a Christian, for instance, because it is this universal, everyone can be Christian. Well, everybody can be a part of the kingdom of God. I think a lot of times you actually end up with a very hypocritical worshiping of Christianity, because take the medieval era, for instance. If it was only about creating a kingdom of God, there would be no reason for these different Christian or Catholic kings to go to war with each other. So that shows that political expediency is actually valued higher than religious expediency. They would rather fight for their own will to power, so that's one kingdom, being stronger than another kingdom, than actually, worshiping their God, for instance. Because otherwise, war would only go in the form of crusades if it was all about religion. So, of course, political expediency takes primacy. And I think that's sort of the hallmark of the pagan worldview, is that there's nothing restricting these different pagan peoples from fighting against each other, because each people has their own tether to the gods, so to speak. You could be Athens and you could be Sparta, and you could both be technically within the quote unquote nation of Greece. Of course, they come together during times of great turmoil when they had to fight off Xerxes' Persian invasion. But within their gods, which are pretty much the same between Sparta and Athens, it's completely justified for them to both seek primacy over the other, whereas it really doesn't make sense for two Christian kingdoms to fight against each other if they're truly and absolutely dedicated to the religion, if that makes sense. Anyway, that's just a little thought I had, but I'll pass the conch to you, Ark, and hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and to go back to the universal nature of Christianity, something interesting that you see with Christianity is that Christ is open to everyone, right? Christ, the Christian God, is open to everyone regardless of culture, geography, and in that way he is a universal God. But you see that the belief systems or sects or denominations associated with Christ differ quite a bit. You have Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Protestantism. You could have someone who's like a very enthusiastic nationalist in some European country who is also a Christian, and then you could have someone in South America who's a Christian, and then you could have someone who's like a liberal. A lot of the churches where I am, they all fly the various liberal flags. And I remember in college, one of my teachers said that in his church, they call God she, and when they read the Bible, they replace all the he pronouns with she pronouns. So
very cringe.
Even though Christ is universal, the interpretation of Christianity is not at all universal. It's very fragmented. And I think it's interesting to consider a European paganism, which would be the opposite of that, where the worldview, the European pagan worldview, is shared. So you could go to a Norse pagan and to a Hellenic pagan. They both believe in similar ideas about fate, honor, excellence, and so on, but they worship different gods. So kind of the opposite of Christianity here. And, the Norse pagan might be devoted to Odin or Thor, while the Hellenic pagan to Zeus or Apollo. And in that way, the various branches of European paganism would be tied together with a shared worldview, but remain separate and exclusive. And a Hellenic pagan, it wouldn't really make sense for him to worship Odin. He might pay some respects to Odin as, a god of a brother culture, but he's probably not going to devote himself personally to Odin, because Odin is the, Norse, Germanic god. And in that way, you can have this kind of exclusivity. You have gods which are tied to specific peoples, specific cultures, histories, and places, with their own literature about them, and so on. You have, therefore, an exclusive, local religion, but at the same time, you have a shared worldview, and you can have this grander element. So it's not just countryside rituals, which is kind of what paganism suffered from with the coming of Christianity. Christianity posited this grand vision, and with paganism, there was a lot of smaller local communities which had rich cultures, but they didn't have this kind of grand, all-inclusive historical vision. And so it's interesting to think about, if you take that approach with paganism, you could have both. You don't have to necessarily give up the grand vision, but you can still have the kind of exclusive element as well.
That kind of reminds me of the concept of multipolarity that you hear a lot today. Not one I necessarily agree with, but in sort of, I think this is changing. But of course, the zeitgeist since World War II, and especially after the Cold War, has been the primacy of quote unquote liberalism globally, right? You think of your globalist cabal, and you think of this sort of liberal world order, and of course, I think that's changing, right? But one of the oppositions, you hear guys like Dugan talk about multipolarity. So it's sort of this belief that, well, maybe not every culture is attuned to liberalism. He talks about the Russian culture, and I tend to agree with him on this, that the Russian culture does not, it sort of craves a strong leader. It craves a strong center. So this sort of fracturing, factional, parliamentary reality of liberalism does not fit within the Russian culture. So what you're talking about with paganism and sort of being defined by local traditions as opposed to this sort of universal grand vision, which is why I think Catholicism was so successful, is because largely it adapts to a lot of the local traditions and sort of allows it, right? It tolerates it. So then you get a lot of pagan traditions within Christianity. And of course, Christians might say, no, 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 it's actually not pagan. No, no. I mean, these are a lot of these holidays that you celebrate originate as pagan holidays. And anyone who's trying to say otherwise is kind of coping here. But Catholicism tries to do this to a large degree. If you go to Mexico, for instance, I mean, it borders on heresy within Catholic dogma, but they tolerate a lot of local traditions, which is, of course, a lot of where you get pushback from the Protestant side. Is a lot of the Protestants will be like, "Oh, you guys are literally pagan." But anyway, I don't really care either way, since I myself don't really partake in that these days. But it's worth noting, right, this sort of vision that you are presenting as being non-universal and being sort of dependent on each locale. And of course, it's sort of similar to this nationalist vision that you might get with unique identities within each of these specific areas. One thing I will say, though, and why I've always loved the ideal of Rome, is there is this sort of, it's not a universalism in the Christian sense, but it's an all-encompassing vision of expansion, of wanting to conquer all that is underneath your gaze. And of course, we talk about the steppe peoples. Well, there is an old steppe prophecy, which has existed in different variations, but most famously in Mongolia. And the prophecy was that a great Khan would come forward and conquer the world, literally conquer the entire world. And of course, interpreted by the shamans and whatnot in Mongolia, they believed this to be Genghis Khan, and surely he came the closest. I think the Mongol Empire was the largest, largest uninterrupted land empire. So I think that technically the British Empire at its height was bigger, but of course, a lot of that is divided by seas and oceans and whatnot. But I believe the Mongol Empire was the largest contingent land empire. But it's this prophecy of complete conquest and complete domination. And this is something that I think the Romans, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, many Romans felt that it was their prophecy to literally conquer the world. And I think that's the ultimate ideal. I think it's something that Evola talks about with the concept of imperium as the ultimate state of man, which isn't just petty nationalism or petty local governance, but absolute expansion, even to the point where you might fail, which I think is the ideal that I generally believe is most worthy, this sort of manifest destiny, right? So I guess what I would say is, while I think there is a great deal of value to this sort of multipolarity, so long as the world order is bad and evil, right, which I think we can agree is the case with the globalists and the liberals, when a strong, exceptional, and virile worldview takes primacy, then I would shed the multipolarity and I say, okay, well, let's embrace this. So it's interesting, and maybe you have some thoughts on this as well, but I generally believe in not universalism in the Christian sense, but in an imperial vision, one which seeks to have unlimited borders and does not try to limit its expansion. And this is why I generally think that like nationalism is sort of this petty phenomena, because it's always, well, we're just going to be our country. We're just going to be Hungary. Well, why not? Let's be Hungary and let's conquer Romania and let's conquer Serbia and so on and so forth. But anyway, maybe you have some thoughts on this.
I certainly do. First, I'll circle back to Christianity for a little bit, and then I'll talk about the imperial question because it's an interesting one. But as to what you were saying with Christianity, especially Catholicism, taking on various pagan elements and rituals and these sort of things, I think what's interesting is if you take the worldview approach to a revival of paganism, then you could actually have, and I get a lot of heat for talking about this on my channel because this is something which upsets both pagans and Christians, but I like the idea that you could have a pagan Christianity where you take Christ but understand him in the context of the pagan worldview. So just as someone could be devoted to Odin within the pagan worldview or Zeus, one could also have a pagan Christianity where they understand Christ in the context of the pagan worldview, and then they perhaps use texts in addition to the Bible, like stuff about the matter of Britain, Arthurian literature, this more mystical understanding of Christ as a nature god and that sort of thing. So I always find that topic interesting, and I think I'll be making another video on that soon to kind of close off my thoughts on that subject. But as to the question of imperialism, actually, I do have a different perspective on this. Because what if the imperial impulse is actually what destroys nations and peoples? I think this is a view which you can find in ancient Greek literature. Herodotus puts forth this view. The idea that when an empire gets too big, it is struck down. And in the narrative of the Greco-Persian Wars, you see this idea. Xerxes is this king of a massive empire. He's this monarch who rules over this massive empire. And Herodotus puts forth a narrative that he was destroyed because of his basically insolence against the gods. He rose too high. And I think he says something like, just as Zeus strikes the tallest trees with thunderbolts, so he strikes down the largest empires. And so it's kind of an early theory in Herodotus of over expansion, basically, an early theory of history that empires become, when they become too big or too overextended, they are inevitably struck down and destroyed. And, the Greek states rather unified against the Persians, but they really differentiated themselves from the Persians in regards to them being free. But what that meant to them was being independent, right? So they had, instead of all of the Greek city-states being subservient to one monarch, they all had their separate states with their own rulers, their own systems of rule, and their little nations. So they were like basically a little conglomerate of nationalists, except their nation was basically their city, fighting an empire. That's kind of how they seem to have saw it. And I think there might be something to this, because when you look at Rome, yes, Rome was a great empire, but Rome also had a cataclysmic downfall, which led to the Dark Ages. And as I've talked about on my channel, in many ways it was Rome's universalism, because they came up with, as you say, the universal state, the universal imperium. It was through that universal imperium that Christianity spread, right? The universal imperium was kind of the body, the infrastructure through which Christianity spread. And then you had the basically Roman idea of the right, to turn into an empire. So you had the emperor, the Caesar, merged with the idea of Christ. So you have the one universal political leader under the one universal God. And then if you look at modernity too, if you look at what nations in Europe are kind of the worse off in every regard, basically, in terms of the immigration crisis and kind of just ideological crisis, which nation is down bad out of all of them, I think you'd have to say it's probably England. And England was the nation that had the biggest empire. Whereas, countries like maybe Norway or Denmark aren't doing as bad. And these, were smaller. They had their great kingdoms and wars and so on throughout history, but nothing close to the English Empire. And then when you look at it, the United States as well, it's not hard to think that the United States might have been better off if they stayed an isolationist nation. They might have avoided a lot of the problems that we have today. So I think that's an interesting objection that could be brought against imperialism. And then maybe one final objection might be that in ancient times, imperialism, I think, could be more advantageous perhaps than it is now. Like, you could have the steppe peoples come into Europe, right? And they implant their culture, their genetics. That was a very successful expansion. But you have to wonder, is that type of conquest possible today? Because modern imperialism is much more focused on government and economics and that sort of thing, right? So I think it's much harder for the United States, for example, to come in today and let's say invade China, right? And make an impact that's so great that the Chinese have then 50% of their genetics replaced with genetics from the United States, and they start worshiping Abraham Lincoln as a great god, right? So I guess the other question would be, how feasible is this stuff today?
Apart from feasibility, I think is necessity. Because if you want to, so going back to what you're talking about with empire being too big and collapsing, on the flip side, these empires last a lot longer oftentimes than the smaller city states or nation states because it's able to preserve its independence. So if you look at like you're mentioning Greece specifically. Well, one of the reasons why Greece sort of fell before the Macedonians took over was because these city states were afraid of Athens growing too powerful. One of the issues of democracy, for instance, is that within a democracy, it limits the growth and power of exceptional individuals in fear that that individual will become a tyrant. And this happens many times throughout Athenian history, where a general becomes too powerful and he gets struck down by the sort of larger polis in Athens. This happened to Themistocles, who was sort of the hero of Xerxes' invasion of Greece. Him and Leonidas. I mean, if anything, a lot of historians will argue Themistocles was far more instrumental to the victory of the Greeks than even Leonidas was. Leonidas is simply he's remembered better because of the romantic vision of the final stand of the Spartans, and rightly so. But Themistocles was eventually banished by the Athenians because they were afraid he was going to get too big and become a tyrant. Aboclides was banished by the Athenians because they were afraid he kept winning battles against the Spartans, and of course, eventually he sides with the Spartans. We want to talk about the survival of nations within this sort of fractured city-state vision or nation-state vision. There is no real guarantee that a single nation-state can preserve itself, because ultimately preservation rests on power. And so long as power is fractured, it's sort of dependent upon this non-aggression principle between different nation states or city states. And of course, you see this in Greece, and the reason why Greece is eventually absorbed into the Macedonian kingdom and eventually the sort of greater Hellenic Empire was because of what happened during, I think it was the Second Greco-Persian War. And if you read like Thucydides' book on that period, essentially what's happening is the Athenians get too strong, the Spartans and their allies come together to defeat the Athenians because they're getting too strong. The Athenians are winning at first, and of course, eventually, the Spartans sell out and align with the Persians just to defeat the Athenians, right? They had to ally with a stronger power to get rid of them. But what you see here is that it's sort of a state of anarchy. No one nation state can really preserve its independence without help from another. So then ultimately, the instrument which actually preserves independence is solely power. And my belief in the empire is always that the only way you preserve your power as a nation is by being the strongest nation. And you can't do that if you respect the autonomy of other nations. You have to subsume them either politically or actually physically. And when we talk about China, for instance, it's almost necessary that one country has at least imperial levels of power, because if China got too strong, for instance, you're not going to be able to beat them with a confederation of small nation states. You need one large power to defeat them, and that's probably going to be the United States. And why I think it's necessary that the United States is not isolationist, for instance. And of course, we were isolationist for a long time, but we are forced out of isolation for our own self-preservation, right? And whether that world is better or worse than the past, that's obviously under debate. But as a political force, at least, the United States was forced to come out of isolation to survive. And on the topic of immigration, I don't think that's necessarily. I think true. We do think that the UK bears the brunt of it, and I'm sure they do, largely because of their imperial history. But I mean, if you look at statistically which countries have the highest levels of immigration per capita, that's going to be Luxembourg, that's going to be Belgium, that's going to be Ireland, that's going to be Spain, Switzerland, Austria, and then Norway and Sweden. In fact, we talk about Denmark for a second. Denmark has about the same immigration per capita as the UK does. So it's like, at the end of the day, it's kind of just become an unfortunate inevitability in Europe that you have such massive uh, immigration into these countries. I don't think it's necessarily whether or not you're an imperial power. I think the more specific correlation that we see is that these more developed countries, which have largely become very liberal, and of course Sweden is starting to push back against immigration significantly with its new government, and they're actually undergoing mass deportations right now. So I'm sure you're going to see a vast change in Sweden. But I think the general trend is that these more developed countries have been taking in more refugees, because the where you have negative immigration is countries like Poland, for example, or Romania, which, you know, are relatively less developed than those other countries. But anyway, and going back really quick to the whole the Christian question, I guess, is so seeing Christ as sort of like somebody within the pagan pantheon, which is what you suggested. I think you could technically do it as Christ the man, but as Christ within the Bible, I think it's sort of impossible, just because Christ is within the Bible, within the canon of the Abraham or of the Christian faith, is meant to be the Son of God. Of course, there's the verse, I think it's John 14:6, where Jesus says, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." So it's sort of this very straightforward path that one must take if they're going to worship Christ. But I think largely Christ is sort of this Dionysian figure. And of course, there's a lot of old texts which sort of trace Dionysus as this Eastern figure who gets introduced to the Hellenic pantheon. And I believe he undergoes a very similar sort of crucifixion and rebirth that you see with Jesus. So I'm sure there's a lot of similarity there. But within the Christian canon specifically, it like Christ's position ontologically depends on him being the Son of God, and therefore sort of I don't think would work within a wider pagan pantheon. So unless you really change how you view Christ, for example, like, you know, in Islam, Christ is not seen as the Son of God, but as a prophet. And in many other sort of Abrahamic rooted faiths, he's seen as a prophet. I mean, in Judaism, he's seen as a heretic, of course, and potentially the Antichrist. So there's all these different views of him. But canonically within Christianity, I think that you can't have Christianity within paganism just because of ontologically what Jesus represents to them. But if you were to say, well, we're just going to take Christ the figure and sort of treat him as a pagan deity, of course, maybe you could do that, but then it wouldn't be Christian anymore. So that's just my thoughts on that. But yeah, in terms of the imperialism question, I think that ultimately, if you do not strive to be an imperial power or as strong as possible, then your existence will always depend upon other nations, and you'll never truly have autonomy. It'll always depend upon alliances and diplomacy. And within alliances and diplomacy, you're always going to, unless you're the strongest in that alliance, your interest will always come before the interest of the strongest within that alliance. And you never know where that's going to point to. So for me personally, I think the imperial vision is the only true vision that one must take if one actually wants to have control. Because I think ultimately, whether you're a nation state or an empire, you'll pretty much always fall, right? I mean, the only country I can think of that somehow has been neutral throughout everything and survived is like Switzerland, right? And they're sort of an anomaly because financially they're very influential, so they're able to, you know, stay out of people's businesses, and they have rugged terrain and a strong army, whatever. But it's like very rare that even nation states survive for that long. So when you talk about an empire falling because it grew too big, I think it's far more common that a tribe or a nation state falls because they're too small. But I'm sure this could be a conversation for another time, and it gets into this big whole, you know, study into the dynamics of power and all this. But it's certainly an interesting conversation to be had, and maybe something we should definitely talk about in the future. But no, I think you know, we got a lot of good stuff covered today. So I guess I'll pass the conch back to you if there's any like sort of last things you want to talk about.
Yes, well, I guess to close off the imperialist question, I would just say perhaps the ideal, though, is to have the strongest nation, but not an imperial one, because I think that is possible. You could still have a very strong nation, which is not imperial. But yeah, I think you'd have to, it's a much longer discussion, but it's certainly interesting to think about. And as to the question of pagan Christianity, definitely, I agree. It would be something very different from biblical Christianity. Um, but I still like the idea, and I still think it's possible to have that. Um, but whether something like that would actually ever take off, probably not. I imagine it more as a smaller kind of sect, perhaps of a pagan revival movement. I doubt the average American is going to be saying that Christ is representative of Dionysus or uh, Pan or something like this.
It would be pretty funny to see a bunch of evangelicals doing cult of Baptist.
Yeah. Hey, you never know. You never know. The evangelicals finally catch word that Christ is actually
Christ
Odin
is Dionysus. Christ is Dionysus.
But yeah, I don't know. You have any other things to say about paganism, imperialism, Christianity?
Yeah, everybody, don't forget to, the best way you can worship, whether you're a Christian or a pagan or whatever else, is to give the Ark and I a ton of money and send us mail-in goth girls. No, no, but no, it's a good talk, and I think that we have a lot of questions that we can certainly bring up in future conversations as well. I think the whole conversation about imperialism is very interesting. And has a lot of religious ramifications, as we sort of demonstrated today. So I think that's something we can definitely pick up in the future. But other than that, I think we covered a lot of good things. And thanks for joining me here in Greece. I'll fly you back to Mars on our flying Pegasi in a bit after we go out in town and do some debauchery. So yeah, thanks for coming on, Ark.
Thank you, as always.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks for listening and tuning in. Ark's got a cool new video coming out as well, which is sort of similar to the things that we're talking about. So definitely tune into that. But as always, thank you for watching. And Legionaries, wait the call. It may come at any day, and when it comes, make sure you're trained and ready to go. Other than that, signing off. Thanks for joining us, and y'all have a fantastic rest of your day. Ave.